Hello and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects podcast. Today we are in New Zealand, of all places. And I must say the weather out here is significantly better than the weather in Sydney, where I've just come from. So I took the opportunity here to sit down, and we're gonna record and talk a little bit about teams. We don't have Warren and Nick today. I think Nick is in Singapore somewhere. Not sure what Warren's doing, but for those of you who love Warren's energy, never fear. We have a guest who runs at that level right here. So I think we're gonna make up for it today. So excited to be sitting down with Paul and Andrew here to talk about teams. Guys, do you want to do a quick introduction? Paul, starting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Paul Bloem. I've been MVP for the last, 6 years now? Hopefully 7 soon. I look after a team that has got sort of collaboration, team, Skype for Business, all the pretty stuff that gets connected to that. But more importantly, these days, I'm focused on adoption, on governance, compliance, and that sort of thing.
Very nice.
All right. My name's Andrew Morpeth. I'm also an MVP, been one also for about 6 years, I do believe. So I'm an ex-Skype for Business guy, I suppose. Well, still a little bit of Skype for Business. Came from the office communication server days, so very much engrossed in the enterprise voice stuff. Transitioning at the moment into the Microsoft Teams world with enterprise voice glasses on at the moment, but sort of working on all the other stuff that Teams brings to the table.
And it brings a lot to the table, right? I mean, I think it's been the constant theme for a couple of years at least now. There's been a lot of talk about Teams and Teams this and Teams that. And, obviously we just come from Ignite 3 months ago now. Can you believe it? 3 months. And there was a lot of announcements at Ignite, and I mean, have you guys seen anything new since Ignite that kind of sticks out to you?
Yeah, my favorite new functionality is really the SharePoint view that you get when you're looking at your folder structure within Teams, being able to look at the date and timestamps and being able to change the views and create perhaps even my own view. I really like that. That's been a long time coming.
It adds a bit of complication, but I like it as well. I like that familiar view that you get from SharePoint in there. Bit more buttons to get used to, I suppose, for some users, but I think it's a welcome addition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, very nice. Yeah, and I mean, I think just recently I saw there was the read receipts have now kind of made its way as well, which is kind of fun because especially when you're in a situation where islands mode, you don't always know if the dude's going to be reading the message that you sent.
It could be seen as a bit big brotherish. It is configurable by policy, but again, I like it. It's good to know when someone's seen your message. And of course, the expectation should be set that chat isn't instant message, right? It's not. The expectation is not instant anymore as it was in Skype. And sort of training that out of people is a hard thing because we still get those messages of, hi, and then they wait for a response, hi, back. And don't just get to the point in chat because they're not used to that persistent nature that Teams brings that Skype never had.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, read receipts or in any form of communication is always an interesting one, right? Because like even me personally, on my phone, on iMessage, I don't have read receipts turned on. Yeah. So, it's your guess if I've read it or not. But then when I use WhatsApp, because I use WhatsApp a lot as well, I like, the fact that folks can see that I've, read it or not. And it helps me when I can, and I guess maybe it's just the different types of people that communicate on iMessage versus on WhatsApp.
Yeah, well. That's right. Depends who you're trying to avoid, I suppose. And iMessage has most of your contact address list in it. So,
When I'm speaking to users, I'm always talking about having some form of a social contract. And that is just the nature in which we behave together. Yeah. So if we know, hey, if you've read a message, then, and if I want a response, because that's our social contract, then please do respond. Or whether we're sharing files or whatever it is we're doing, there's sort of a social agreement as to how we'll be operating in that team. And I think that's essential. Otherwise, you do get that, hey, are you just ignoring me or what's going on? Yep.
And it's hard because sometimes you need to gather your thoughts on something, right? And I like, to me, I guess etiquette would dictate that, like, hey, give me a second, or hey, I'm looking into that for you, I'll get back to you in a second, right? Just to give someone a response so that they know you have acknowledged the message. I find that that's something that doesn't exist all that often in business anymore, right? There's this, I need this from you, give it to me type of situation.
Yeah, a bit of the now thing. Everyone wants everything now these days. It's what we're conditioned for, I suppose. But that comes back to that social contract, right? And that's why the adoption piece is so important. And unfortunately, it does get left out quite a bit, and I think that's probably especially true maybe in our region because we're a little bit she'll be right. The users will figure it out. Let's spend the budget on the technology. The message I've got is that we can just turn it all on in the cloud. We don't have servers to deploy. There's far less services cost in that regard. So that should be transitioned to watering and feeding your users and keeping them up to speed and making sure they understand the tech because it's changing so quickly that it's really hard for anyone to keep up with. Even myself, right? I mean, I struggle to keep up, and I'm dealing with a single product.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, organizations are looking at the technology and going, we can deploy this at a much cheaper cost. Let's save that budget.
Yeah.
But the real challenge is that traditionally folks haven't measured success in the way you would think they would. They'd measure success based on, does the technology work? Check, it works. Yeah. Does it do what it said on the label? Yes. But what they never measure is, are people using it or are they circumventing it? Is it actually being adopted and used? Are you actually getting value for money for your investment? Or is it just a white elephant you've just paid for and, don't worry, you've saved some money on it?
We've had some great conversations on this show about adoption and the difference between adoption and consumption, right? And why it's really important to measure the value that comes out of adopting something as opposed to, we have someone log into it once every 6 months, and so therefore the license is justified. So it's interesting, and I think it can be a very deep topic of conversation just by itself. But what are you guys seeing as far as Teams adoption, right? Because if you listen to Microsoft and the Microsoft message, right, obviously there's a lot of investment going on in Teams. The Teams product group are doing a lot to promote and market the product. Are you seeing people
100%.
adopting it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, most of the customers I think we touch have already deployed Teams to some capacity. So, Microsoft wants seats turned on, and that's what they're pushing, right? But most of the customers we're seeing, they've already turned the stuff on. They just need help to do bits they don't quite understand. So enterprise voice is a key one because it is still reasonably technical. So that element we get pulled into a lot. I guess the SharePoint aspect of it and the document management stuff is a complex problem a lot of organizations have. They might have things in Dropbox and various other storage solutions or partially or not properly deployed SharePoint, so need help in that regard. Those would be the two key things, do you think, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a lot of organizations, because we've got quite a long, rich history in the Skype for Business world. What we're seeing is a lot of organizations, existing customers and some new, who are going, we're on Skype for Business, we want to go to Teams. And the challenge I'm seeing is I'm going to them and I'm going, well, if you want to go apples for apples, because that's what they say to me, can you please show us compare? And I say, you can't, because Skype is an apple, but Teams is a fruit salad. Yes, there's some apple in there, but there's a hell of a lot of other stuff in there you cannot ignore. And so that's often my point of reference, just trying to bring them on board and show them that Teams is actually a portal through which you access many other things, including a slice of apple.
Yeah, fair enough. That's very well said, actually.
I like that one, yeah.
I think we might use that in future.
I've got to adopt that too. I've heard it many times, but haven't adopted it into my own vocab yet.
Do you think there's a difference or in the way adoption is happening in, like, here in New Zealand or in the APAC region, for example, versus North America and the rest of the world?
That's a good question. We don't have the visibility we have of what's happening elsewhere is through our connections through the MVP program and that sort of thing. What I'm seeing, and I'm sure, Andrew, you're probably on the same page, a lot of organizations, there's kind of two parts to it. There are those who are really keen to jump in and get it done and who are happy to see the limitations or see the challenges and find ways around them, because you've highlighted them up front. And then there are others who go, I'll just sit back and hold until you tell me it's all good. And that's kind of the two views when they're coming from sort of a Skype world, and they're including Andrew's specialty, enterprise voice.
If I was to take a guess, I think it comes down to size of organization as to whether and how much time that they'll spend on adoption. And in the New Zealand region, I guess the typical business size is probably under 100 seats, right? We get the odd, 100, 500 seats, 1,000, 4,000 or 5,000 is getting pretty big. Biggest company in this entire country is about 35,000 seats, right? So I think it probably comes down to that. So my expectation would be sort of North America, etc. A lot more bigger companies. They would probably spend a lot more money on that stuff. They've got a lot more people to address, harder to get the information across versus, say, a 100-seat organization. It's a lot easier for the IT department to just do that. They kind of personally know the users and, it's a bit easier.
Yeah, we're having to come up with ways to introduce adoption concepts and principles in bite-sized chunks, getting back to my fruit analogy, because no one's got the funding to eat up the whole bowl, right? So we've got to give them little spoon-feed chunks as they need to.
And I think that's absolutely fascinating, though, and I had not considered that the market sizes, the average company size is going to be smaller, and so the way that when you're in a smaller business, there is more of a familiarity of, people know each other, people know the IT people. And so I think you do deal with training and adoption slightly differently to, when you're a 100,000 seat company and the IT guy doesn't, you're just a name or an email address to them, right? They don't know each other. No one knows each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, when you're looking at the adoption, sort of the portfolio of skills you need, there's all these different roles that when you look at the Microsoft framework, there's all these different people you've got in there. You come down to old New Zealand and what do you find? Well, you're it, man. So you're all things to all people within that space. And so, it is what it is and you just got to go with it.
Yeah, fair enough. And so with that, I guess if we look at the types of companies around here, are you seeing one of the things we've seen a lot of over the last 6 or so months, maybe 9 months, is tenant-to-tenant type migrations, M&A type situations, right? And for a long time, that process was pretty well understood and we had it down. We knew with the workloads that most companies adopted, we could do those types of projects pretty easily with some tool sets and things like that. But with Teams in the mix, and because of people adopting Teams, it's inevitable that every tenant now has some form of Teams stuff, right? And just recently I was working with a customer where they had kind of sold off a part of their business, divested a part of their business, and they had 2,500 teams. And the new business was only taking like 500 of those 2,500 teams. Wow. And it became, it was a very interesting. Yeah. I got to know the Graph API better than I probably would have ever wanted to know the Graph API in that project. But it was fun though, but it is very complex.
Yeah, the tools for that sort of tenant-to-tenant migrations, they're, they're hardly existing, right? They're pretty juvenile at best. And so a lot of that comes down to the skill sets of the resources you're using. And that can be
creative thinking.
Quite a challenge.
And it definitely, I think that the point there, or at least to me, is it's arguable whether the investment in, because let's be honest, you can do anything. If you put your mind to it, we have PowerShell, we have automation things. At the end of we can get there, right? Oh, you want to migrate conversation history? Well, there's no real API for that, but we could probably get it done. I know Lee Ford, an MVP out of the UK, has a fantastic script that does some stuff. And I used his stuff a lot in the past, or at least on that project. I owe you a beer there, Lee. We'll see each other at Summit. I'm buying the first round.
I'll buy the second.
Yeah, but you got to get to a point at some point where you go, well, the resource cost associated with coming up with these kludgy homegrown solutions isn't with the reward of getting the stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to, and we had a discussion about that earlier today. Sometimes you've got the sort of idea of perfection or nirvana of where you got to go, and then there's the budget.
Yep.
So you got to kind of draw a line in the sand and go, look, we can give you that perfect outcome that you want, but it's going to cost you a hell of a lot of money. So what are you comfortable with paying? How much can we deliver for that? And you've got to set that expectation right from the beginning, and it gives you a bit of leeway to deliver accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part. That's our job as technologists, right? Is to be upfront with our customers and actually advise them to that, right? I think unfortunately there's this sort of sense lately of people just becoming button clickers, right? Instead of actually being advisors or consultants to their customers, because it's so much cheaper to do a project 100% remote than it is to go and stand there talking to your customer. But when you're actually spending the time with them, you can actually then have these types of conversations and actually deliver significantly more value than just next thing through that.
That's right.
Thing.
That's where in-person is so important. Even video conferencing to a degree. You need to get to know people and have candid conversations, and at least initially need to have those in person. I still think there's still merit in that.
Yeah, we're still old school that way within our team. Any project that we kick off, we always insist on, initially at very least, getting that eye-to-eye contact, our body language, the customer's body language. You basically instill confidence, and you help them to appreciate that, hey, these guys know what they're doing and they're here to help you. And of course, between Andrew and I, we're always waiting for that first project in Fiji, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
Yeah, or any other island nation, as long as it's hot.
So tell me about, and I think you might be the best, Andrew, you might be the best person to talk about, so the islands mode trap.
All right,
Definitely something that we've seen a lot of.
Yep. I've heard that term coined. I haven't quite used it myself, but it's certainly a problem. Microsoft obviously want adoption of Teams, and for them, islands make sense because it means by default, generally speaking, if you're E3, E5, one of those plans, it's going to just be turned on unless the admins have done something to circumvent that, right? You just get it. So if someone starts using it, sends an IM to chat, I should call it, to someone or some sort of message, it will get to the other participant and they can kind of join and it's there. The problem I find with it is it causes interop issues because in islands, as the name suggests, both Skype for Business, if you're using that, is very separate to Teams and they run independently of each other. And with islands being the default, you really need your customers to understand that they need to drive adoption away from Skype into Teams and make sure everyone's aware of it, because things that can happen, for example, is I send Paul a chat message, right? He doesn't know what Teams is. He's never used it because the company hasn't announced that it exists. It's just turned on and he's found it. I've found it and I've sent him a chat message. Yes, he'll get an email notification say someone's trying to get you in Teams, but he's never heard of it. He's, what's this Teams thing? Throws it in his junk email, right? So it creates a poor experience for the users who are using it, and the ones because of the ones that aren't interested in kind of self-learning it. So that's where the problem is. So what you really want, in my view, is you want to make a call up front. You want to decide what platform you're going to use and set that mode accordingly. For one, by doing that, it ensures that the interop works. We get a lot of customers saying, it doesn't work. And it's not that it doesn't work, it's that probably you're in islands mode or probably you don't quite understand what the modes actually mean. So in the very basic sense of it, there's a Skype only mode, which essentially your Teams is disabled and you only use Skype. And then at the other end of the scale, there's a Teams only mode where you don't use Skype anymore and you fully transition to Teams. There's modes in the middle that let you transition features across. For example, there's a Skype with Teams meeting mode, right? And those modes essentially will allow you to present to the user what they should be using and what client. And if you have half your user base on Skype and half on Teams, it guarantees the interop based on the modes that each of your users are on. So if I'm in Skype and I send a chat message to someone who is in Teams, I don't need to know that they're in Teams. By setting those policies correctly for each user, Microsoft will make sure that happens, right? And largely this works well, and it works even for Skype hybrid server deployments. So yes, I think it probably is a trap. It's probably not the best default. I understand why Microsoft have done it. But it's up to you IT admins out there to get across it and make sure you deploy the mode that suits you and understand what it means.
Yeah, I think so. Bottom line here is it can be really confusing to the end user when you get messages flying around and I saw this internally. We were in islands mode for a long time, and I was on Teams only because I was one of the test guinea pigs, right? But then like my manager, for example, would not be, and so I'm trying to IMing from Teams to Teams, but his presence is away because he's not even looking at the Teams client. He's using Skype for everything. So I end up having two contacts for him, one that has the Skype icon next to it, one that doesn't. And it like for me, that's confusing. Can you imagine for like an end user who has no idea what's going on here?
It's a shame because the technology we're talking about is designed to connect people.
Yes.
And
correct.
yet
Yes.
we're in a situation where we're disconnecting people.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think really important to just spend the time here thinking about not only like where you want to go, what the best user experience is going to be for your situation, but also make sure the timeline is understood, because it can be a very easy trap to fall into, forgive the pun, we're going to enable this, it's going to coexist, so we don't need to worry about accelerating the deployment because, hey, it's going to work, right? Yeah. It's kind of like a hybrid deployment. There are a lot of folks in the Exchange world who use hybrid as a long-term coexistence mode, right? Which is fine, and it certainly works for that. But you don't want to be doing that with this. You kind of want to use it to make sure that you're transitioning correctly, but get the transition done as quickly as you can.
Yeah, it's got to be a driver.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, once customers understand what it means, it's actually a reasonably easy decision to take to the business and say, look, we need to make this decision. What's it going to be? And then the easiest thing to do, and if people had done it out front, right? Or if Microsoft had made Skype only the default because everyone was on Skype, or something like that, and then actually forced the admins to make the decision, it probably would have created a better experience, because people would have had to go and turn things on and really understand what it meant. I personally don't like the default, but yeah.
I'll back you up on that. I totally agree. I don't like the idea of having dual apps with overlapping features. It confuses people. But as soon as you change those modes to something else, you're taking something away. And if you ever want to annoy users, take something away. So it leaves you in a nasty place, which I guess is a good thing for us, since that's how we make our bread. Eh?
Well, one thing I find amusing is that is completely the opposite in the personal world. Like, people run around with WhatsApp, iMessage, everything on their phones. They got no problem switching between them for different chats. But when it comes to enterprise, it kind of has to be run by the business that you work for. Otherwise, they're disinterested in it for whatever reason.
But we're at a point now where things are so, like, the always on or on by default is such a thing now, right? Like, I think the Teams app is now being deployed with Office, right? So you can't even get away from it. I often use my wife's company and organization as a great kind of example of a lot of things, because they use the whole gambit of technologies. They use Google, they use WebEx stuff. And I know the other day I was looking at a laptop for something. I was helping her out with something, and I was like, hey, you have Teams? And she was like, oh, that just got installed the other day. I don't know what that's for.
What a shame.
Yes. Exactly.
Case
so
in point.
it's kind of just it's a great example of actually being able to, communicate to your users when change is coming. But also there's so much overlap between so many different things, and different vendors are doing the same things. And, why on earth the WebEx folks called their product Teams as well is just beyond me. Like, it just,
Mix it up some more.
let's not scratch open that wood right now. So let's talk a little bit about I guess direct routing and the voice side of things a little bit more.
Okay. So for those that don't know, direct routing is essentially a bring your own SIP trunk to Microsoft Teams. It's an over the internet encrypted SIP trunk between your session border controller or SBC to the Microsoft Teams edge. There's various ways you can deploy it. So you can use a supported or certified SBC. So there's the likes of Ribbon, Audio Codes, and there's a few other ones, Oracle, and I'm trying to rattle them off the top of my head here. But the other way you can do that is it's opened the doors for telcos to start offering this service as well. So they're building out their SBC platforms to support direct routing, and then offering SIP trunks directly to Teams on your behalf, right? At little to no more additional costs is what we're seeing in the market here. So, it might be $1, $2 more for a SIP trunk as opposed to something delivered on premise that you'd have to hook up to your own SBC. They take away the headache, and that makes sense for a lot of customers who are trying to get everything off prem, move everything to cloud. They've already got a telco relationship. That telco offers the service. They just turn it on, migrate the numbers across, and you're done. There's still some merit, I think, in having an SBC. I like it when customers choose the SBC option selfishly, probably because it gives me a in-between vantage point to see where things are going wrong if they're going wrong. It also lets me do things like manipulate numbers and do some diverting and different things like that that's not quite there in the Teams admin center at the moment, or available as a feature, right? So the SBC gives you some additional capability that you wouldn't have if you go for a run-of-the-mill hosted solution. So those are sort of the two options we have in our market. And there's obviously the Microsoft calling plans, but they're only in sort of 11, 12, 13 countries off the top of my head, where you're just buying the minutes directly off of Microsoft.
What would you say would be the percentage of organizations who already have an SBC that and they're just essentially using what they have versus new purchases?
Yeah, a lot of our customers, because we've been just head in the sand with Skype for Business for so long, so many years, all the customers we deal with are pretty well. I'd say 95% of our Skype customers are enterprise voice enabled, which means they have SBCs. A lot of those SBCs have always been Microsoft certified, so therefore they can be firmware upgraded to support the Teams journey. So yeah, most of our customers who have Skype definitely will have an SBC. If they don't, you can buy one, you can go for the hosted service. These are all supported virtualized now. So, you can pick one up for a few $100. It's a reasonably cheap entry point.
Yeah.
If you want to host it.
Yeah, we have a split with some organizations, and there's a number I'm working with at the moment who are trying to be resilient geographically to, disasters and that sort of thing. But a lot of them have components that don't traditionally work with sort of a hosted or cloud-based SBC. So they might have some elevator phones, they might have some niche contact center that doesn't talk to Teams. And so we'll use the session border controller as a voice gateway or router that allows you to intercept and interoperate these different platforms. Fair to say those are massively more complex in terms of deployment and looking after and so on. And that, I guess it's fair to say, that's our kung fu. We make some good margin off that. We know that space very well. And those who have gone down that path have made that choice knowingly because of constraints, functions, features, that sort of thing that's not available in the Skype or even Teams world.
Yeah, that's right. The key things we use SBCs for, if we have access to them ourselves, number one, unallocated numbers. So there's no real way to handle that in Teams right now. So in the SBC, I can see that Teams doesn't know what that number is, and then I can basically do a reroute and maybe rewrite that as the reception queue or something like that and send the number elsewhere. It's probably one of the key things that we use it for, and also just general number manipulations, which, as far as I can tell, I've seen some stuff surface in the PowerShell properties, but I don't believe they're accessible to be set just yet. But there are some translation capabilities that I think are going to be surfaced in Teams soon, so that will negate some of this. But that's probably the key thing that we enjoy having an SBC for, on top of the traceability, being able to see what did Microsoft say and what did the telco say, and where should I focus my efforts to find the problem, versus don't have an SBC, I need to look in the Microsoft portal, try and garner as much information I can from their logging, which is not as detailed as SIP traces, and go from there. And then maybe I've got to engage the telco because it's their problem. So it takes a little bit longer, whereas on a SBC trace, we can figure out exactly what's going on straight away.
Yeah.
I can see how that would be beneficial, and how potentially having some third party doing the sort of cloud SBC situation would cause a situation of people just pointing fingers at each other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But then you also have, if you really want to keep it very simple and you're potentially a smaller organization, you could just buy the minutes. If you're in a supported market, you could just buy the minutes from Microsoft.
That's true.
Then you have the one throat to choke, as they say, right? Because it's all
exactly.
Microsoft's thing then.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there's plenty of options. It just comes down to your preference. And we just normally talk it through with the customer. Totally up to them. We don't push any particular way of doing it down their throat. It's
we don't have a preferred service or anything like that. Where we basically go pros and cons. What's the customer's current relationships with whoever they're dealing with, and then we try and work with them to find something.
Okay. And how about? Are you seeing a lot of customers replacing their traditional PBX systems with Teams? And do you think Teams is ready for that? Is it ready for prime time?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer. It's not quite there, really. It's at the tipping point, I think. So where it will suit a customer is where you've got simple requirements. Okay, so where we're mostly seeing people take the plunge to enterprise voice in Teams is professional services type industries, because they don't have super complex requirements. It's generally people like us, lawyers, accountants, those types of people who are making and receiving calls directly to them. And they might have a receptionist or two receptionists or something like that, simple call flow coming in that distributes calls. That works pretty well, but there still are limitations even in that, right? The call queues are getting pretty good. Some of the features of the call queues are getting better than Skype. Some aren't quite as mature. The biggest ones that we come up against that are well worth noting is, by default, from a queue, you can't forward out to a PSTN number. That's quite a common requirement. Maybe an on-call tech or something, you need to forward directly out. So workaround, you need a dummy user account that's fully licensed. So you kind of have to create your own creative ways of doing things. Another one that impacts us, I think it's more of an APAC issue, not a global issue from other people I've talked to, is that there's significant call queue delay. So when you answer a call queue call, I've seen up to 8 seconds before you get audio, right? So that's a pretty disjointed experience for the agent trying to answer calls, right, where they've got to sit there and wait for the audio to kick in. So that's problematic, and we've had to, for some customers who don't think that's acceptable, and I don't think that's acceptable personally, some customers live with it, but for customers that don't want to live with it, we've had to use, again, dummy user accounts using the call group capability of a user endpoint type setup, right? So we create a call group in the user config and distribute calls that way. Yeah. Again, another creative way of doing things to work around some immaturities in the product. So, if you're going to move enterprise voice to Teams, my general message is you've got to be willing to deal with some rough edges. I wouldn't call it bleeding edge anymore, but it's kind of just come out of the bleeding edge, and it's for the early majority, certainly, who are willing and able and prepared to be kind of flexible in, working around how they might have expected it to work versus the realities of it. Yeah. So you really need to make sure you understand how enterprise voice works and compare it feature for feature for what you've got and what you've come from, and determine what you're prepared to give up to get to Teams for enterprise voice at this early stage. Yeah. But enterprise voice is not what Microsoft's really pushing, is it? It's really the collaboration stuff, the documents. Right, so that stuff's going to mature. They're moving it from the Skype Online world. It's getting there. It's. I've always said probably by the end of this year, we'll probably be at the point where, man, these features are actually probably better than Skype now. A lot of them are already kind of better. I like the auto attendance better, the text to speech. There's a lot of stuff that's better. There's just some stuff that's just not quite there yet.
It needs a bit of time to mature. So a lot of businesses are not quite ready to take the plunge. They want to see it prove itself, and who can blame them? Yep. But for me, the real shining star in the team space, when you're coming from a Skype for Business background, is the meeting space. I absolutely love the meeting space. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Being able to see, and there's some really cool things coming that I just can't wait to get my hands on. And just having a look at Skype versus a Teams meeting, it kind of feels a little 80s now.
It does. Skype hasn't changed much past, what was it, Messenger, It's still that same sort of format. It looks nice, a bit nicer, but it's sort of that messenger. It's very old school instant message, So Teams is definitely the new thing in the way forward. And just jumping back to modes, right? This is where you can use modes to your advantage. If you're a Skype customer and you're on enterprise voice and Teams isn't ready for you, you've checked it out, you can still enable your users as Skype for Business with Teams collaboration and meetings. So that lights up meetings in Teams, and you've got the collaboration stuff, which Skype arguably either doesn't do, and meetings probably not as good. You can light that up in Teams, but still ensure that the enterprise voice features are still in Teams, in Skype. Sorry, yeah,
that's actually a good point. I think we're seeing rapid development on this, though, right? It's not like Microsoft were promising or making promises a year ago that they're still making today. Or they're
delivering stuff, but Skype didn't really change too much over the last, between 2013 and 2015 versions. There were a few sort of small additions, but it hasn't fundamentally changed for quite a long time. Whereas Teams is new and exciting, and it's certainly the way forward, and it's, I think, meeting the needs of the modern kind of information worker much better than Skype does or ever will, because Skype's, I guess, at the start of its sunset in a lot of ways, right? It's still a valid product. We still recommend it where it makes sense. And the great thing about choosing Skype is that you have a way to get to Teams. You can still deploy Skype and have some of your users on Teams. You can have some of your users using Teams Meet. You've got the best of both worlds if you go that way. And it's still a completely valid solution. But it's kind of where the PABX was 15 years ago when Skype and these UC platforms started coming out. PABXs are still around, but they're they're almost dead now, right? Skype's going to be around for 5-10 years, I'd say, before it disappears.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It's been incredible. I come from a PABX background. I used to work for Siemens, and the mentality there was delivering services in a way that they could address what they perceived as problems, like pickup groups and hunt groups and all this sort of thing. And I always say that with Skype and also with Teams, the notion is different. I always argue with, when I'm doing training sessions with users, I always tell them that when I'm trying to reach you, who knows best how to get hold of you, me or you? Well, you do. You know whether you're on the run or whether you're at home or whether you're in a hotel. So I shouldn't change my behavior of reaching you. You control how that's delivered. And that's fundamentally how it's changed the way people communicate. It's been brilliant. But the scary bit is it's developing so fast. And that's scary, but it's also very exciting. And very often, and we might have to take a time check right now because this might be invalid by the time I get to the end of the sentence. The current state of features is evolving so fast that sometimes I'm busy showing somebody something and then I find that it's changed.
Yes. Well, we will run into that problem every now and then, right? The best is when you're in the admin center trying to do a demo of something that a customer's asked and then you can't find where it is. And you're like, I saw this was here just yesterday. And they're like, yeah, sure it was.
Do you know what you're talking about?
And it's just because the UI has moved something just a little bit around. It's a problem, right? But I guess it's part of the challenge we have is just going to stay on top of that. And we talked about, I guess, Teams being a fairly, fruit salad versus just an apple, right? But I mean, I guess one of the questions that a lot of folks probably listen to this or watching this have is how is their skill set relevant in the new Teams world, right? Because I think to me right now, there's no such thing as a Teams SME because Teams is made up of so many different pieces, hence the fruit salad, that it depends on your background and where you come from.
Absolutely. It's at this early stage, there are not a lot of people on the planet who have got a handle across even 80% of the underlying bits of technology. And we're finding that, so traditionally coming from a voice background and then having lots of Skype for business and now transitioning into the governance and compliance areas and all the adoption stuff, when you look at that whole spectrum, you do need different skill sets across. So you're dead right. There is no such thing as one person who knows it all. And we're finding that, we've got some SharePoint guys in the team and I'm relying heavily on them. And they're teaching me things all the time.
Yep.
And just getting a feel for how they, put things in place around governance, compliance, and, around all that sort of control bits. I'm learning lots. But what I'm finding is there's a lot more consulting than actual pushing nerd knobs and buttons.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. I somewhat miss the Skype days where you could be intimately familiar with a single platform and just know everything about it. Because now in this world, you cannot know everything about the entire stack. And Teams is just a window into multiple microservices in Teams. So I'd say to sysadmins, you've already got a whole ton of skills already that you may not know you have because Teams is leveraging stuff you already know.
Yep.
It's just a window into that stuff, right? So yes, it is a collaboration-focused product and there's stuff to learn in that regard, but a lot of the underlying technologies you're probably familiar with.
Yeah. And it's almost, it's almost like the different areas or components of it also make for different deployments, right? So, for example, when you have a voice deployment, your voice requirements are, I guess, fairly binary in terms of customers are going to know they have these phone numbers that need to be answered in this way or handled in this way. Yeah. But when it comes to the compliance and the governance stuff, that stuff's going to be so varied based on industry and location. And very often, customers don't actually they don't understand the requirements that they have, right?
It's new to a lot of customers because they've been small. They couldn't afford to put that stuff in, but now it's just, they get it.
Yep.
Yeah. So they can deploy it, but they know nothing about it really.
And if they don't make the right, it's almost like making the right governance decisions up front, if we take our minds back to, 8-10 years ago when Yammer was, first busting up on the scenes, it may even have been longer than that. I don't want to go back that far, but I have battle scars from, but it was one of those things where, like, if you didn't in the very beginning put in some really solid governance, it became such a mess, and then fixing it retroactively afterwards was really hard. And Teams is kind of like that too. I think, like, if you just enable it and just walk away, you're going to come back in a week and it's going to be
absolutely. So take your Yammer problem, and I'll see your Yammer problem with my SharePoint issue from 2010,
exactly,
which was just turn it on and she'll be all right. What happened?
Yep.
And then we'll throw in some Skype for Business and a few other bits and pieces, and guess what? We have the most complicated combination of things we've ever seen.
Yeah.
And so what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. and people, people are almost like, because we talk about, I've said this already one time today, we talk about change management and adoption a lot on this show. And we talk about governance and compliance and all of these things. And a lot of people think that these are just buzzwords that we're throwing out because they sound cool. Yeah. Well, there's very good reason why these things come up over and over and over again. Is because, I'm sure you guys also see customers who have not made the right decisions up front or have kind of gone down the wrong path just a little bit, and then you come in and now you're trying to backtrack just a tad to help them out. And so the message is consistent because these things are really important.
I tell stories to highlight.
Yes.
So we keep the innocent by not naming any names.
Of course.
And I always tell them a story. So depending on the organization, and I hear some scary stories. I heard a story last week from a customer who said, we don't like to, talking about shadow IT, we don't like to force our users down any particular path. They're a creative bunch and we don't want to limit that. And of course, at the same time, they're an organization who's creating new things. And if those things were to leak, well, they'll be the end of them. And so once I married those two things together and said, so I've got some pictures we took the other night, Andrew, I'll share them with you. They're in my Dropbox, and I accidentally share the entire Dropbox directory. I also have some very sensitive information in there that I now unknowingly have shared with you. And I can't even tell who's accessed it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so there's all this kind of stuff. So I usually just find an angle for the customer in question, and then I'll tell them a story, lead them down a path. Yeah. And usually at the end of it, they've got these massive eyeballs staring at me like I've just scared the hell out of them.
And you don't have to necessarily go bananas on it, but you've got to at least sit down and have the conversations with the business and just go, at least make an informed decision, and go as far as you can afford to or want to, or but at least have a bit of a think about it before you just turn it all on.
Know the risks, right?
Know the
risks.
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very good advice to kind of I guess top off or come to a close here. Guys, it's been awesome chatting to you. Thank you for taking the time and showing me around Auckland and the great weather and whatnot. And before we go, I guess we always kind of like to plug, give you the opportunity to plug yourself. So each of you, starting with you, Paul, how do you want to be found? Do you even want to be found?
I'm not hiding. I try to make a bit of noise on LinkedIn. It's just Paul Bloem _NZ. That's where I'm at. And of course, my blog is ucsorted.com, and that's where I am. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I'm mostly active on the Twitter community. My handle is Andrew Morpeth. That might be a bit difficult to spell, so find me at ucgeek.co. That's my blog. So check me out there, and the links to Twitter and various other channels that I post information on are there as well.
Cool. I'll put all of that in the show notes too, so folks can just click through and I guess the next time we'll be seeing each other is at Summit coming up in
looking forward to
bring it on.
A month or so, just short of a month. So
I know now it's been recorded. First round of beers, second round of beers.
Yeah, fair enough. We know
he's not offering anything. Obviously.
We may or may not be at Joey's at some point during summer.
Sure we will be.
Brilliant.
Well, guys, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate the sit down here, and I'm sure we'll be chatting again.
Thank you.
Cool.